Okay, so yeah, something completely different. I remind you of the question. Maybe the question was like, how can I say that my literature is not engaged, and how does it relate to studying philosophy and so on? It's also a big question. I try to. Again, it's kind of ambivalent. Like on the one hand, I love research, and I think one of the reasons why I write is because I love to research, and it just gives me the opportunity to, to get into subjects that I want to write about, and to take a few years to get into these subjects. And I wouldn't do that if I wouldn't want to work towards a product, basically. So that's great. And when I was writing this book, I was reading a lot of ethics about animal rights, like Peter Singer, obviously, and Bill Kimlicka, all these people who think about that question of personhood for non-humans, basically. And I was also researching a lot about apes, not from an ethical, but more from a zoologist and evolutionary psychology point of view, basically. And that was great. So yeah, I did that. The second point is maybe that still what I was doing, especially when I was talking to researchers, not so much to philosophers about it, was to shift the view and look at these researchers more than at their subject. And I think that's also something that is kind of a difference between what I did in ethics or philosophy and what I do now, that I look at myself and I look at why does that interest me?
Yeah.
Like, why am I concerned about whether gorillas are persons or not? And that I think is the big difference, that you have to take yourself into consideration. Like as a writer, you kind of do reflect on yourself and on your own weaknesses and what your interests tell about your psychology and about like your what you don't want to admit to yourself and so on. And the third point maybe is that I think philosophy taught me really that, or like especially my dissertation, which was about the argument of self-defense in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and I wrote a 500-page dissertation about that, and took me about 5 years, and I noticed that basically I noticed a few things. I noticed that you can approach any political subject only by researching, in a decent, in an appropriate way, only by dealing with it for 5 years, basically, every day. Make it like a 9 to 5 job every day, and for 5 years, and then you might understand it. So basically, I realized that it doesn't make sense for me to get into anything on a shallow basis. It doesn't make sense to judge at all, and that's the second point. Like once you look at any political subject in that depth, you see that there is no right and wrong, and that was also very important in my novel. That none of the I don't take a stand. The positions are all there, and they're all valid, and there is no stand that I'm taking, and that kind of shows me basically that literature, yes, and that comes back to your first question, that literature is kind of the best way to deal with these political, or with these questions that we read about in the newspapers, because you cannot summarize them like the newspapers do it. It's always like the story of one person, and there is no black and white, and you cannot summarize it, and it's always like really, really tiny details that you basically have to all bring together in a 500-page dissertation or a 500-page novel to really mirror the situation as it is. And so yes, in a way, yes, literature might be a good way to describe these things after all. Yeah.
Good, thank you.
Well, when I came to school at Michigan State University in '96, I promised myself I would never write again. I promised I would do my homework every night and I'd be a good student. And for a couple of years it kind of worked. But before I wrote a lot of short stories. I wrote quite a lot. I got my first recognition when I was very young. So the problem was, I believe in January '99, I hope I'm not wrong with the date, when, in Michigan they have this beautiful broadcast, it's called Where Local News Come First. And it's lovely. I mean, you just look at them and everything is so cool and nothing spectacular happens. And one night, the first news in Michigan was about Bucharest. And I was like, oops, that's going to be bad now. And the story that I've seen, it was really about the same social problems, about a union of miners trying to pretty much take their demands to the government, and they street fights with the forces, and it was bad. And that was actually my nightmare. What if they're going to come again? What if it's going to burn again? And I was like, 7,000 kilometers away and so on. and I was seeing the same pictures. And this is when I had this idea. I have to let this go. I mean, I have to do something about it. And how do you calm yourself down? You're thinking about a comedy, where you're putting all your nightmares. You try to turn them into a big, wonderful joke. And in a couple of weeks, I kind of had the plot. The only problem was in that time, instead of doing my homework, I started to read talking essays. And I wanted to use two fantastic motifs in one single story. And there, the guy said, in a story you can use at most one, otherwise the two fantastic motifs will cancel one another. So I said, what am I going to do now? And I still wrote it. And one of them was the cat, but there is another fantastic motif. And I mean, if the novel holds apart, it's like a miracle. I don't know why. So it's about this character who has two different births. I mean, he's born twice in like two clouds that are coming together. And this is like a metaphor of how, historically Romania came together. It's kind of a complicated story. And some people they find it funny how this actually works for the story later on. But it actually came from watching the news from far away and knowing very well which way this is going. And traveling back and forth while you're actually carrying the manuscript with you, because at that time I was still writing on ink on paper. There has to be some order in your work. And I pretty much I'm very happy when you manage to tell something really profound while cracking the joke, as we mentioned. I mean, if you manage to say it in a way that's informing and in the same time amuses, the battle is won. And I was really happy to see that actually the novel got now the third printing, and I have on Facebook a lot of friends who are actually high school students in Romania. I never met them. And they go like, oh, by the way, about that joke and the cat, and oh yeah, I'm the guy with the cat now. And unfortunately, the news from Romania helped me a lot, so I think we're going to have a fourth printing soon. I have to negotiate actually. The news are helping me, really. It's, sometimes when bad things happen, they resonate with the work that you wrote.
Yeah.
But originally it was just your concern, if not nightmare. Yeah. And suddenly it happens. And then you're a prophet. So this is I guess.
With me, it was always reporting. I started my writing as a journalist for the news agency, so the pieces were very short, and my characters were the presidents, prime ministers, generals, commanders. There was no place for normal people on the street, as pretty though. I was satisfied at the beginning with this kind of reporting. But then, after spending time, especially in Southern Caucasus, when Soviet Union started to collapse, and I was covering Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Central Asia, I realized that, yes, I have the stories about what happened, what people said, what they have done, but they are only words of the leaders, of the creators of the problems, or the creators of the solutions. And I missed the people who were the victims of all these processes. So I started to write future stories, reportage. But it was not enough. It was even in this form for 15, 20 pages, I don't know how many signs it's now. Still it was not the same. And that's how it happened that I wrote my first book. It was about Southern Caucasus, 1994, and because I realized that only in book and not in the journalist form, I can tell the story of the people that I met on the way to meet the president, or waiting for the interview with some very important commander, who was not important commander the day after I interviewed him sometimes. But these people and their stories, they stay. I mean, this is what really happened. And from that moment, I was searching for the characters who are not the victims, but that somehow they are the victims of the big politics. Of course, when war starts in some poor place, you can write about the reasons, about the leaders who started the war, but what was most important thing for me was how war changed lives of the normal people. I was not searching for the war, but it just happened that covering particular parts of the world, you always have the war. And the practice of the journalism is that they will send you to write the horror and not the romantic comedy or the happy endings. This is what the newspapers, the TV stations, this is the most important scoop for you. So because of these people that I met in the waiting rooms, in the buses, on the streets, in the restaurants, the people that who were my hosts in the villages, that's how I started to write the books. You asked me about the difference about Afghanistan and South Africa. For me, I never wanted to write the books on Afghanistan, on South Africa, Georgia, or United States. I was looking for a key. I mean, the story could be South Africa, but I needed something else. In Afghanistan, it was the legend. The first time I came to Afghanistan, it was 1992, when the communist regime collapsed and the Mujahideen took the power. I was in Kabul in that time, and it was like a miracle. I was observing Mujahideens. We called them Mujahideens in that time, and freedom fighters. Now we call them differently, but they are still the same people, and they didn't change in that time. They are still the same, like they used to be in the 90s and in the 80s. They're those who survived. But it was the miracle, observing these Mujahideens in sandals and with old Kalashnikovs who were entering the capital, who won the war against the mighty Soviet army. And it was mighty, especially for our part of the world. So it was kind of legend.
Yeah.
When I entered Afghanistan, I thought that it's like moving in time. In Tajikistan, it was the end of the 20th century. On the other side of the border river, Amu Darya, it was 14th century. No electricity, no cars, completely different people, different behavior. And it was like a legend. When I talked with Afghans, my first impression was this, it's like a legend. And I find out that the story about Afghanistan will be the story, what price you have to pay for the compromise. And do you pay this? Do you decide to pay this? And Afghans, for me, it's my imagination, you also asked about my imagination. They do not want to compromise. They had all possible models of state. They have the monarchy, they have emirs, they have Taliban, they have communist system, now they have republican system, but they are not happy with this. They do not accommodate, they destroy the things that they are not happy with and try to find the best, something best for them. South Africa was a different story. I didn't want to write a book about South Africa, but I was covering South Africa since 1993. And it was my last trip, or one of the last trips to South Africa, when I finally find the key. I went to the very small place, small town called Ventersdorp, and it was the day that the trial started for the black workers who killed the white farmer. But I happened to know him, and he was also the politician. And sitting in the court, I realized that the story about South Africa could be a story about being a hostage of the situation and how difficult it is to change. Every one of us, we are seeking for change and we are afraid of change. And this is the story about South Africa. And it was always the excellence. I mean, if I went somewhere else, not to the court, I would never find out that it could be a story about South Africa.
I think one of the things that was most fascinating in your book about that murder of Terre Blanche was this sense that in order to understand this killing, you had to go back hundreds of years. I mean, this wasn't just about one man and another, between two men, or it wasn't just about color, even when your book really did an excellent job of discussing this history of the Boers in South Africa and the British. And I think in the U.S. we tend to forget maybe I should speak for myself, but I think it's very easy to forget this this sense that things don't always break so cleanly between black and white. That there's an entire history of whiteness and what it means to be white, and there are many different types of people under that, the same way that there would be under the term black. And also, you were talking about in South Africa, the fact that you can have South Africans, but you have to peel apart that label in order to understand all the ethnic groups that are included in that, and how complicated things can get. And your book did an excellent job with that. I wanted to ask Bogdan, maybe all of you, and Ardian, but the place of humor or surrealism, and you know what, Bettina, I keep thinking of you too, even though we're dealing with very hard, concrete facts of our relationship to animals and gorillas, but I think in some way that trip that Marina takes with Yete, it feels almost surreal in how well they can communicate. There's a level above what we're normally used to thinking about our humanness, our relationship to animals. So I'm wondering about this relationship between humor, or maybe the surreal, and the political or human events. Is it possible to be funny about things that are tragic?
So actually, I thought about this for about 10 years, and it actually at some point I'm going to refer now to a story that I wrote a few years ago. The title is "The Night Someone Died for You." It's pretty much the reconstruction of one of the people of the death of somebody who died during the Romanian Revolution in December '89. And the way I think it worked best was to have a first level, the story actually that was advancing towards the moment when the soldier is shot by friendly fire, basically. And then you have a lot of flashbacks. And the flashbacks are from the life before, when everything was peaceful and nobody was thinking that anything bad would happen. Mm-hmm. And this is just about administering the army life. Or you have plenty of room there to joke. Because all these things that are actually dysfunctional, and including the fact that people did not really prepare for a war-like situation. Because hey, when did we have last time a war? In '45, it will never happen again. So that was kind of the feeling. And then you do have a little bit of room for joke. But a couple of jokes, and when I was looking at the architecture of the whole thing, a couple of jokes were too close to the end. And I found that in the first draft, this was bad taste. Then I kind of removed it. And it was just bad timing. So really, you have to compute it carefully so it doesn't mix and it doesn't look cynical.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. So you balance the humor. You balance the humor with the seriousness. Yeah. You have to consciously do that as a writer.
After you read it about 30 times, you kind of feel it where it should be.
Okay.
Even if it's like 300 pages long.
Right. It's an interesting thing to think about, the fact that humor, I mean in this case, humor and tragedy, they really are hand in hand. They can't be too far apart for one to work, for either to work well.
Yeah.
That's interesting. Ardian?
Yeah, I will start with yesterday. It happened that I was reading a book by a Polish writer, aphorist, Stanislaw Lec or Lec. How should I pronounce it? I don't know. Lec, right? Stanislaw Lec. And I came across this aphorism that said, they came and they took him because they mistook him for someone else. But when they returned the body, they had put the right name to the body. Now, this is funny, but at the same time, if you think of it, it's a dramatic story. Not to say tragic, because if this has happened in real life, it's something horrible. And we who come from totalitarian communist experiences, we all know that things like that might have happened and even have happened. But still we find that funny, that thing. I believe because we go up one level and we think of it as a narrative. We kind of detach it from the events. We first make a compromise with the text and say that, well, let's not think of this as something that has happened. Let's think of it as a world in itself that somehow reflects the real world, but not in form, more in content than in form. And then we can laugh about it because there is this contrast between the first part of the aphorism and the second part. And to boot, this aphorism reminded me, there is a short story included in a book that I have written that is similar to this. I hadn't read the aphorism at that time, but even in that story I speak about somebody who is asked to replace a leader during a political trial because the leader was very sick and was dying. He was being tried at that time. He had to be there, so he had asked somebody who was very similar to him. And then in the end, they had him executed, the replacement. And he says, wait a minute, because I am a replacement. They said, let's go on, this is all what you're saying. I mean, you should have come up with something better. So it's more or less the same mechanism. And actually in this book of mine, there are many cases where I somehow make fun of things that if they had really happened, I mean, they would have been dramatic. But the problem is that the joke is also a way that helps us somehow move on, because we cry and then there are many cases where people laugh even during a funeral, right? There is a story, I think it still is the Polish story, about this guy. I don't know why, just these Polish things are. They buried him, and he was one of these new capitalists, the nouveau riche, and when they put him in grave, the cell phone rang, because they had put the cell phone with him. It was the time when you put the most valuable things with the person. They put the cell phone, somebody called him. So it's like a joke, but still there is a tragic moment in the world.
Yeah, I remember the conversation in Georgia in the beginning of 90s. They were in the middle of civil war. And it was the Olympic Games in Spain. It was 1992 in Barcelona. And we are sitting at the table discussing politics, war, but they also asked about the sports results. How many medals we won in Barcelona? And I said 3. And I said, how come? Only 3? How many people you have in Poland? 40 millions. We are only 4 millions in Georgia. We also got 3. And I said, in what disciplines you won this medals? And I don't remember, long jump, tennis, or something like this. And they just smiled. Come on, doesn't count. We won the medals in boxing, heavy lifting, judo. And then they became sad, and they look at themselves and they said, and we won nothing in shooting. We are practicing third year. No medals in shooting. This is not my job. It was just said, and it was also about the home situation in Georgia.
We are running out of time. I would like to, Bettina, give you an opportunity just to answer the question very quickly, and then I will open the floor up for a few questions.
Okay, well, it's a question that I don't know if I can answer it very well as a German, talking about humor first of all, but also like it's something that I really find so difficult, especially as a reader, not so much as a writer, because as a writer I don't really strive for humor. It's not what I'm looking for actually. It happens along the way, and it's more. You said that it's important that it's not becoming sarcastic, and I would actually. I don't understand why it shouldn't be sarcastic. I mean, my character, for instance, I think she is sarcastic or cynical. Cynical, you said, yeah. So that's maybe a difference also.
If the story is a tragedy, if overall it's a tragedy, you don't want to have the jokes in the wrong place in the story. I mean, you could have the jokes up to the moment where it's actually close to the moment where the tragic moment is like.
I don't agree. I think actually that sarcasm and cynical is actually sometimes the best way of talking about these issues. And I just one quick thing, maybe, like as a reader I always find it difficult to deal with books that are striving for humor, because to deal with humor means to write stereotypically. That's one mean of humor, and that means that you cannot take your characters that seriously. Like they're not that shaded. They're usually more like black and white, and that I find difficult. Yeah, and I find that like when we talk about honesty can be very funny. Like I find Freud, for instance, reading Freud is extremely funny because he's so honest, clear, sarcastic, and cynical about the human like the human psyche and how it's made up. And he doesn't intend to be funny, but it's extremely funny sometimes. That's what I like.
Just a quick note, and then we will take a few questions. Is I think Bettina, what works so well in your writing, and particularly the story with Marina, who is an interpreter in a lab that's testing gorillas. And she's the interpreter between human beings and gorillas. And she develops a rapport with one of the gorillas. And what follows next is absolutely astounding. And it's scary a little bit to think of how well they communicate and how well you as a reader can understand this gorilla. But it's said in such seriousness. Marina's a little bit sarcastic, but it's said in this way that that it works really well. It's very eerie. I called it a bit surreal, even though it's so grounded in reality and science. Yeah, you've done a very good job with balancing that. Can we take a couple of questions from the audience? Oh, wow, yes. Yeah, I think we can stretch. Maybe not. Maybe just speak loudly. Stand up.
Project.
Yes. Thank you all for your talk. I was expecting some very professional and boring kind of thing, but it turned out to be really I want to ask a question about how language relates to the territory and to history of people. To each of you.
Maybe quick, as quick as you can, so we have time for other questions.
Yeah, let me try this because I thought about why do I still write in Romanian? Because it's it's a question I ask myself every day, and who's actually your audience? And this is a more serious question, and you can think of the people you're seeing, you're meeting when you're doing the book tour back home. But in the same time, the challenge is quite serious because some of these books, when they are translated, and they're meeting a different kind of audience. And they don't know the same things, they don't have the same historical background. And this is where the challenge is serious when you have a novel that has some historical references. And what I can say is that all this is related to language. I think if you design a novel in another language, I think the whole my fault. So the whole system of references would be entirely different. So it depends on, like, if I'm making a reference to a Romanian poet, modernist poet from the 30s, that can be done in a Romanian text. If you do it in English, you cannot do it in the same way. It doesn't fall in the right place.
Someone else?
Yeah, I can say something. I would say, always referring to my Albanian experience on this. When you think of language and territory, the first thing it comes to mind is a dialect, as a territorial geographical dialect. Basically, you recognize people from the accents they have, even when they speak a literary standard language. And somehow you create certain ideas that most cases they are wrong, but this is what happens. Because of geography, you somehow build the geography in your mind by the way people talk to you. I'm referring to the past. What is happening now, because in Albania, but I think elsewhere too, in Eastern Europe, and not only, there's been a lot of demographic movements. People have moved around the country, a lot of people have come to the main cities, and geographical dialect is not that important anymore. Now it's social dialect that has become important. And for somebody who wants to write and wants somehow to convey this into their writing, you need really an ear to understand this, especially when you come from outside, as in my case, because I don't live in Albania. I go there, I listen to this, it's a new phenomenon, it's a social dialect, it has elements from geographical dialects, but it's not the same thing. And the first time you feel threatened a little bit by this because it's a new element. You didn't have that before. In New York, it's the same thing. There is a certain way of speaking that distinguishes people in New York on the street from the rest of America, even from cities that are geographically close to New York. And I think you have a little bit this phenomenon everywhere. And you have this dialectic relationship between the way people speak to each other, and they create their local communitarian identities, and the official language that is somehow like the constitution, you know, that you mentioned for Romania, but it works in the language too. I think there is room there for somebody who writes to explore this. There is a tension there to explore it, and even, for example, when you have a fairy tale to tell, you tell it, you will impersonate like a folk, somebody who tells it like an old woman or something, but still your voice will be superimposed to it, so you'll have two voices, you'll have three voices, and then you will invite the reader to play with you and separate this so that they get what you're trying to say. So I mean, there are many ways you could explore this. It's a very, I wouldn't say interesting, but it's a very stimulating area for discussion.
Maybe, are we done? Do we have time for one more question?
A quick question, maybe.
A quick question.
Do we have any of those?
Yes.
When I translate from Catalan, and I think there are parallels perhaps with Albanian. And I wonder, when you try to break through the wall or stretch the boundaries of the language, do you go back to pre-dictatorial times, or how do you do that? Or do you borrow from other languages?
In most cases, yeah, it's a very difficult challenge, especially for a language like Albanian and a culture that doesn't have much tradition. We are a young country, and Albanian literature it has 2-3 centuries of life. It's not like Italian or French or even English, or even Eastern European languages that have a rich tradition behind, but Albanian doesn't. So what you have to do when you have to confront it with a rich Western language, you see the translations. Because translation is that area where your language has to give to the reader what the other language is. So they have to elaborate this system that is above a lexicon and grammar. It's a higher system that you need to somehow get familiar with that and then use it even in your creative work. Translations are always the starting point. That's why we give so much importance to good translators, which we don't have at very, very few. But there are some very good translators from other languages into Albanian. So we're lucky to have them. And we could find a way to multiply them, because they create a basis for everybody else then to take their work further.
I think translators is a fantastic note to end on. Thank you all.